Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Emily and today we are going through my April wrap-up. So in the month of April I managed to read 12 different titles and I did successfully read a book for every prompt of the OWL's Magical Readathon, so feeling good about that. I did have to do some finagling at the end of the month to like categorize different books to make them all fit, and like there's one that's a little bit of a stretch, but we're going to ignore that. I only needed to read 7 for my like chosen career path, but I was really in the mood to read this month. I did read a lot of short things as well, so that was conducive to finishing all 12 prompts, which I haven't done before for the OWL's readathon or the newts. But anyway, enough rambling about that. I will just briefly mention the prompts that they satisfied, but I'm going to go through them in order of when I read them. So the first thing I read was the audiobook of In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle. This is a story of a woman who is living in New York City. I mentioned this in my most recent like wrap-up of books I've read so far this year. I don't know what it is about this year and reading books about New York City. I'm not intending to do it, but I've read a lot. But this woman, she is a lawyer, I believe, and she has like always wanted to be a lawyer, just always wanted to make a lot of money, and has had this idea of her life and has always had like 5, 10, 15-year plan. Like she knows where her life is going. On the day that she gets engaged to her partner of several years, who like they've known they're going to get married, they again like just have this idea of their life, she goes to sleep, wakes up in an unfamiliar apartment, and spends an hour 5 years in the future. Everything is different. She's with a different man. She's in a different apartment. It's all very unfamiliar and she has no idea what's going on. She falls back asleep and wakes up and she's back in her normal life. She can't forget what has happened. She is just now has this in the back of her mind always. It was an interesting premise for a story. It felt very similar to like a Taylor Jenkins Reid novel, but I don't know that it really did it for me. Like again, the concept is really interesting and I was really thinking it was going to be more of like a mystery and a romance, and it like kind of had some of those notes, but really it was about friendship, which I loved. I loved that it was more about that than a romance. But I just found the main character to be absolutely insufferable. She just is so concerned with status and money, and there's nothing wrong with like wanting to get further in your career, but oh my god, she was just like relentless. She felt very materialistic to me and very, I don't know, just very focused on things and money rather than like love and friendship and whatever. And I don't know. I liked some of it. It was very emotional. Trigger warning for death of a loved one and cancer. But I don't know. It didn't quite do it for me. I read this for the prompt of reading a book with a white cover, which was for Charms class. It also counted as a book published in 2020 for my Pop Sugar Reading Challenge. I wound up giving In 5 Years 3 stars. Feels pretty neutral as a story, but I really, really disliked the character, so middle of the road. Next up, I read Heartburn by Nora Ephron, and I really wish I hadn't. Luckily, this story is only 175 pages. Had it been any longer, I would have DNF'd it because I was not enjoying it pretty much from the start, but I don't know, I'd heard really good things about it. I'm a fan of Sleepless in Seattle and Nora Ephron movies, so I was like kind of hopeful that it would get better, but it just like really didn't. First and foremost, there is absolutely no plot. Like I love a character-driven story. I can think of a handful of books that I have loved that other people have criticized for not having a plot, but at least like the characters are engaging and there's like interesting conflict. This, I did not feel like that was true. It's basically a meandering and stream of consciousness story about a woman whose husband is cheating on her while she's 7 months pregnant, which sucks. Obviously, trigger warnings, content warnings for lots of cheating, but basically the entire story is like, should she leave him? Should she stay with him? What is she gonna do? Truly, every single character is awful. Like there was no one that I enjoyed. There was nothing that really redeemed this for me. Everyone's cheating on their partner. Everyone's constantly talking about how everyone else is cheating on their partner. There's a lot of racism, ableism, sexism, etc. It was written in the 80s and it definitely has not aged well since then. And yeah, I pushed through with it because I knew it worked perfectly for the Ancient Runes prompt for Magical Readathon, which was to read a book with heart in the title or a heart on the cover. It has both. And then I also read it for a book published in the 20th century, which is the Pop Sugar Challenge. It was definitely one that I just forced myself to finish. And should I have? Maybe not. Would I recommend it? No. Clearly, I hated this. I gave it 1 star. We're gonna leave it at that. And next, we just keep the disappointment rolling with You Are Not Alone by Greer, Hendricks, and Sarah Pekkanen. This is the 3rd book by this author duo. It was the pick for Kayla's Literally Dead book club. I didn't like this. I've read all 3 books by this author duo. This is definitely my least favorite of them all. I think the story had a lot of potential. It's about a woman who witnesses a suicide at a subway station. Again, this is set in New York City. And she sees someone in a subway station throw herself in front of a train. She is obviously very disturbed by this and can't get her mind off of it, ends up going to the memorial service for this young woman and meets this woman's friends. And she's sort of swept up into their life, and yeah. There are a few reasons that I didn't like this. First of all, I think the premise was interesting, but it dragged on for too long. The last 100 pages felt like they took forever to read for me personally. I thought the ending was really lackluster, or I didn't like the twist. I just didn't think it was believable with what we had read up until that point. It seemed really far-fetched that everything that happened was worth it, I guess. I don't want to say anything spoilery. It didn't add up to me. Additionally, this is kind of a small thing, but really annoying to me. There are a bunch of different perspectives in this. Mostly it's from the main character, Shae, and then the sisters, Cassandra and Jane. And like, there's a group of, I think, 6 women, and the others get chapters, but it's maybe like 1 or 2 each. And so, I don't know, I just didn't feel like, I don't know that that was the best way to share the story, to tell the story. But the most annoying thing was that all of the perspectives except Shae's were told in 3rd person point of view, and hers was told in 1st. And it threw me every time, and I'm not even one that gets like, I don't know, it catches on to that. Most of the time I couldn't tell you what like perspective a book is being told in if I'm not like actively reading it at that moment. But it really, really drove me up a wall in this one because it just felt so inconsistent and it was a weird shift. And yeah, I think it would have been better served if all of them had been in 3rd person, but I don't know. I just feel like the story was interesting enough. I don't like the narrative choices, and I think that the twist was just, it was, I don't know. It wasn't quite what I wanted. I ended up giving this 2.5 stars. I did read the majority of this when it was dark out, so I used that for the astronomy prompt, I think it was. And then for the Pop Sugar Challenge, oh yeah, this one was a little bit of a stretch, but I used it for the prompt of an author with flora or fauna in their name. And I've seen other people doing this, so I don't feel like that cheap about it because I don't think I'm stretching it too much, but hen in Hendricks is a fauna. It's an animal. But let's talk about a redemption read. There is some sort of reading god looking out for me because after those 3 very disappointing books, I read Beach Read by Emily Henry, which might be my favorite book of the year so far. It's definitely up there. I loved this so much. This is a story about January Andrews, who is a rom-com author, and following the death of her father and the new knowledge that he had a mistress for several years, she moves to a house that he left her in his will in Michigan. She's been really struggling with her latest book. She's got a deal with the publisher, but she has nothing to go on. She is really, really struggling creatively. So she moves to this home. She's intending to sell it, and so she figures kind of like seclude herself for a summer. Turns out her next door neighbor is none other than Augustus Everett, her college writing program rival and fellow author. He writes literary fiction a la like Cormac McCarthy and sort of a like great American novel. And so they are very much at opposite ends of the writing spectrum. And they develop a bit of a relationship as they live nearby one another. And I mean, it's a romance. It's sort of like, rivals to lovers. And I just freaking loved it so much. First of all, Gus, the love interest, Gus Everett. I don't often find myself feeling like I have a crush on a character in a book, but I absolutely did with this one. I loved their relationship in general. I felt that the conflict was believable. You know, I mean, in every romance, there's like a reason that they like have to take some time apart. You know, as soon as you start to read a romance that's coming and that they'll get together by the end, but like it still hurts. Anyway, I felt it was believable. I a lot of times feel like it just relies on, or romance novels rely on something like miscommunication or just like not sharing your feelings or whatever. I felt like this was more than that. And the two of them were really dealing with a lot themselves, and it wasn't just about their relationship, it really was about the two characters. And I thought Emily Henry did a really good job developing two fully fleshed out characters as well. Obviously, as a YA author and as a romance author, she really understands that perspective of like people not taking romance or YA or whatever genre seriously. And that was never the focus of this, even though it so easily could have been had it been written like by, you know, a white literary fiction dude. I feel like it could have gone that way, and it didn't in this one. It was never pitting the two against each other as like one is better than the other. It was more like each are equally difficult for different reasons, and they both required an equal amount of effort. I really, really liked that commentary. I'm not a writer, and I can't really speak to how that is portrayed in this, but I thought it was a fresh and unique commentary. Overall, I just felt like this was everything that I needed at the moment. It was deep, but also lighthearted and funny. The banter between these two, I've said it 1,000 times, but it's one of my favorite things about this book. And I thought Emily Henry did such a good job. It's so smart. And yeah, I could gush about this for ages. Obviously, I gave it 5 stars. I used this for the Muggle Studies prompt for the magical readathon, which was to read a contemporary, essentially, or told from the perspective of a Muggle. And the Pop Sugar prompt of read a book with a book on the cover. Next, I visited an old favorite and read Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This was a reread for me. I read this series for the first time back in 2017. I did read this during my weekend reading vlog that I posted fairly recently, so I'll leave that up above and I won't go too in-depth because I did share a lot of thoughts in that. Basically, this is the story of our main character, Darrow, who lives beneath the surface of Mars, and he's a Red, which is the lowest member of society. His community spends their time drilling for like helium or something as a way to purify like the atmosphere of Mars so that people can eventually come and live on the surface. So basically they're paving the way. He works hard. He is in one of the most dangerous jobs that he can have. He's recently married and very in love with his wife, Io. And that's sort of the setup. I don't like to go into too much more with this book as far as a synopsis because I genuinely believe, and having read it now twice, I really believe that going in knowing as little as possible is the most fun and shocking, because there is a twist pretty early on that really took me by surprise. Knowing it was coming up in the reread just made it a little bit less thrilling. I still really enjoyed this book the second time around, but I do feel like I maybe didn't enjoy it as much as I had back like 3 years ago. First and foremost because I think I knew what was coming, so I kind of could understand what was going to happen. But for some other reasons as well, I will link my Goodreads review below, which has both my original review from 2017. I also wrote like an updated bit with spoilers marked. So I dropped my rating from a 5-star to a 4-star for this. I still really liked it. I still think I might continue reading the series. this year. We'll see. It does get pretty dark, but I think like knowing that ahead of time maybe like would make it less intense. I don't know. So for this one, for the Magical Readathon, I don't know, it's like a little bit cheating. I'm using this for the Care of Magical Creatures prompt of read a book with a beaked creature on the cover. This is a wing, which leads me to believe it's a bird, which leads me to believe it would have a beak. But I really needed to just like move things around a little bit to make it work, and I just wanted to complete all 12, so don't like come for me if you think that's cheap. It is what it is. Yeah. And then for the Pop Sugar Challenge, I used it for a book with more or a higher than 4-star average rating on Goodreads. After finishing that, I was feeling like it's a little heavy. It's a lot. It's a pretty intense book, so I wanted something a little bit lighter, more fun, whatever. And again, this was in my reading vlog, but I read Moonstruck, which is a graphic novel by Grace Ellis and Shae Beagle. And I was a little disappointed by this. I thought that the story had some interesting elements to it, and it has fantastic rep. It also has really beautiful art. But I don't know, the plot for me felt a little all over the place, and I couldn't always understand how we'd gotten to certain conclusions or whatever. The ending felt very abrupt, and I didn't love that. Overall, it just, I don't know, it didn't pack enough in it for me, which I often find with graphic novels. I ended up giving this 2 stars. I don't plan to continue with the series. I used this for the herbology prompt for the Magical Readathon, which was to read a book starting with M as a reference to Mimbulus Mimbletonia, which is a plant in Harry Potter. And then I don't know that I used it for Pop Sugar prompt. Next up, I read Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey, which is very difficult to say. I always trip over it. This is a Western novella taking place in the like near future America, and our main character Esther is escaping an arranged marriage that her father has set up with the man that her best friend, who was previously engaged to, but is no longer engaged to because she was executed for possession of illegal propaganda. Esther was in love with her. So she stows away on a cart that belongs to a couple of librarians who basically are known in this world to like bring approved materials from town to town, but really there's a lot more to their profession, I suppose. This book is super queer. It's like never explicitly stated, but being attracted to the same sex or being non-binary or being different is just not really accepted. It's only seen as something that exists in literature. There is a character in this that uses they, them pronouns. Sarah Gailey does as well, so its own voices for that representation. And there is a queer couple. There's a lot of rep in here and a lot of commentary on just like that sort of fascist restriction on material, literature, that sort of thing. I don't totally know how I feel about it still. I enjoyed it. I don't know that I have enough to like compare it to really understand all of my feelings about like certain elements of it. Like the Western part, there is sort of like a like shoot 'em up situation. I did enjoy this. I think I would probably give it 4 stars. It is at the end a little like I want more. Like I understand this is a novella, but like I wanted a little bit more. And mostly I just like wanted to know what was going to happen next for Esther and like where her story was going. But anyway, I ended up using this for the prompt of reading a book outside of your favorite genre for the Magical Readathon, and the Western prompt, obviously, for Pop Sugar. Moving along, I read another novella called The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. This is a story about a person, a man who is taking a British citizenship test, and yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. It is really short, but basically he is faced with more complex questions and decisions than he would have anticipated prior to sitting the test. I thought this had some very interesting thoughts and commentary on morality. I felt like it did a lot in like 110 pages or something. It's really, really short. I read it in a single sitting. I don't know, it made me think quite a lot more than I was expecting to, I guess. I read this for the prompt for Potions, which is reading a book under 150 pages. It didn't count for a Pop Sugar challenge, but I ended up giving it 4 stars. And yeah, I don't have much to say about it because I still feel like there are a lot of thoughts going through my head about it, but none of them I can articulately express. And then another novella, 3 novellas in a row, I read Come Tumbling Down by Shae McGuire. This is the 5th book in the Wayward Children series. I talk about this series all the time. I absolutely adore it. It's about a home for children who have gone to other worlds and find themselves sort of rudely and abruptly dropped back into our current day. The series, I think it's interesting, alternates between like a full cast of characters where there are all these very different people who have explored different worlds working together on a single like issue or problem or whatever, and then the even numbered books are about one particular world, which I think is a really cool setup. I think that's going to continue. This one follows a full cast of characters, but it really does center on the world of Jack and Jill, who we met in the first book and the second book as well. This definitely wasn't my favorite of the 5. I felt like I didn't fully get connected to the characters like I have previously. Minnie, you don't belong up here. I'm now sort of kicking myself that I didn't reread the first 3 books before reading this one. I don't think you need to, but they give you more context and just like remind you of the characters. The 4th one is totally separate, in my opinion. I planned to do that and then just rushed into this. I do want to reread this, so I'm holding off fully reviewing it until I have the opportunity to at least reread the first 2. I also listened to the audiobook, and I don't know that audiobooks and novellas are like my match made in heaven because I get very easily distracted, and with novellas being so short, if you miss even just a couple minutes, it's like, yeah, you missed a lot, and I check out kind of a lot. But anyway, I adore this series and this world, and I love all of the representation in it. I love the writing. I think Shae McGuire is super creative, and yeah, for now it's sitting at about 4 stars, but that could change. I actually ended up picking this from a random number generator. I had originally picked something else for that challenge, which was for divination, but it just wasn't quite what I wanted, so I picked out like, I don't know, 10 or 15 super highly anticipated books for my TBR bookshelf and then randomized it from there. And for the Pop Sugar challenge, I used it for a book by an author who has written more than 20 books. And then I finished my reread of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone via the illustrated edition. I had started this back towards the end of 2019, and I got like 75 or 100 pages in, and one of the challenges for OWLs was to read a book featuring witches or wizards, and I have very few of those on my shelf. So I finished this reread and just really, really enjoyed it. I love Harry Potter. You all know this. I definitely have a lot of comfort associated with this series, and it was perfect for this weird time that we're in right now. The illustrations are great, and I just enjoyed myself. So this was for the History of Magic prompt, and I'm excited to revisit the rest of the books eventually. It's definitely not a top priority, but when needing something kind of comforting, I'll definitely turn to these. All right, just 2 more. The next one I picked up was The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Drake, which I adored. I ended up reading this all in one day, loosely for Dewey's 24-hour readathon, but this takes place in Maine, where I grew up and where I live now. And it's loosely inspired by Twelfth Night by Shakespeare. This follows our main character Violet, who is sent off to live with her uncle in coastal small town Maine after her brother attempts suicide. And he is off to a rehab facility in Vermont. Her parents are staying in their home city of New York City. And so she's feeling a little bit like she's an outcast. She had a really rough year herself. She was drinking a lot, partying a lot, having a lot of sex, and just her parents are kind of at a loss for how to like keep her in control. But so she goes to live in Maine in this town called Lyric, which is famously founded by her grandparents, or great-great-great-grandparents. Her great-great-great-grandmother was in a shipwreck off the coast of Maine and found her way to this small town, met her husband, and they founded Lyric, this town. And so the town slogan is like, "We exist because of their love," or something like that. And so her family's a big deal in this town. I loved so much of this. First and foremost, I love that it takes place in Maine without relying on like caricatures of what Maine people are like. Often I don't think they're represented totally fairly or accurately in media. The hillbilly like Mainer archetype, it has a place. It is not inaccurate, but it is not everyone, and it's definitely, I feel like, the predominant way that the state is portrayed. So I liked that. I also loved that it's so much about Violet and her brother Sam and being a good sibling, but also what it means to be a good friend and have good friends. It's about love and identity, and there's a lot in it. Violet herself, she explicitly says in the book that she doesn't really have a label that she uses for her identity, but she is attracted to both men and women. There is a like legitimate love triangle in this where like everybody likes everybody, which is interesting because it is different than your typical love triangle. And overall, I feel like this story just like completely swept me up, and I couldn't put it down. I just so wanted to know what was going to happen. They tried to solve some of the like unanswered questions about Lyric and her great-great-great-grandparents, and I loved it. I loved it so much. I feel like if you enjoy A Million Junes by Emily Henry or Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno, those are definitely a similar vibe to this one. I definitely recommend if you enjoy those, or if you enjoy sort of like whimsical, contemporary. It doesn't really have any like fabulism or magical elements, but it has sort of that vibe. I used this for the Defense Against the Dark Arts prompt, which was to read a book that's set by the sea or the coast. It did not fit for a Pop Sugar challenge, however. And finally, I read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is again, a novella set in a world where time travel exists, and there are at least two, we only hear about two entities or like organizations that exist to kind of control events in history. It's also like parallel universe, like there are all these different strands and threads throughout time that our main characters travel to kind of influence effects in history and the future. It's also an epistolary love story between Red and Blue, who again are on opposing sides of this time war. And it is so intriguing. It is really weird and kind of difficult to get a grasp on at the start. I found it did take me a little while to really get into this, and it took me several days to read despite it being pretty short. I really liked the love story. I don't know that I felt as connected to it as some of my friends have or other reviewers that I've seen. It is a female-female relationship, and it is told through letters over the course of centuries, I think. It's kind of unclear, but across all space and time, basically. I really like time travel in this sense, and the like multiple universe thing really is intriguing to me. It is also just very creative and unexpected in a lot of ways. I don't know if you've read this, or if you do read it. I would love to have a conversation about it, because I know I liked it. I gave it 4 stars, but I don't totally know like if I can say why. I don't know. I want to talk about it, so let me know if you've read it. I used this for the Transfiguration prompt for a book that features shape-shifting, and then I used it for a book with birds on the cover or a bird on the cover for the Pop Sugar challenge. Okay, those are all the books that I read in April. I'm like sweating and feel like I've got a sore throat now. But I had a really good reading month. I read a lot of short things, and I feel like that allowed me to feel like I was accomplishing a lot in a time where I don't always feel like that. Again, if you've read any of these books, please let me know in the comments. I would love to talk about them. I feel like I have so many thoughts about so many of these books and I don't know where to place them or how to express them, so let me know. You can also find links to all of my social media accounts in the description box. If you enjoyed this, as always, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my next video. But until then, happy reading. Bye.